A snowstorm that freezes people into living statues. The first snowflake hit Ethan's windshield just past the old bridge, dissolving instantly against the warm glass. He didn't think much of it at first. Snowstorms weren't unusual this time of year in Frostvale. But this snow was different. It wasn't light and feathery like he was used to. It fell in heavy, deliberate flakes, as though each one had weight, blanketing the landscape in an unnatural stillness. The quiet bothered him. He rolled down the truck window, expecting to hear the familiar howl of wind through the trees or the crackling of frozen branches. Instead, silence pressed against his ears, thick and smothering. Even the truck's tires seemed muted as they crunched over the freshly fallen snow. "Damn weather," Ethan muttered, his voice startlingly loud in the oppressive quiet. He tightened his grip on the wheel and squinted through the whiteout. The road ahead was vanishing into the blizzard, and the distant peaks that framed the town had disappeared completely. His cabin was still an hour's drive away, but he'd never seen a storm like this roll in so fast. The truck's headlights cut a shallow path through the snow, illuminating ghostly tendrils of white that danced and twisted in the air. Ethan tapped the brakes as something appeared up ahead, a dark shape on the side of the road. At first, it looked like a pile of snow-covered debris, but as he drew closer, his stomach clenched. It was a person. The figure stood motionless by the shoulder, coated in frost. Ice clung to their clothes, their outstretched arms, and their frozen face, eyes wide with a terror so raw it sent a shiver through Ethan that had nothing to do with the cold. But the most unsettling thing was the eyes. They moved. They followed him. Jesus Christ. Ethan slammed on the brakes, his truck fishtailing slightly before coming to a stop. His breath fogged the windshield as he stared, hoping he'd imagined it. But no. Those wide, frozen eyes blinked, the faintest trace of humanity buried beneath layers of ice. Ethan's first instinct was to help, but dread rooted him to his seat. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like the storm itself was watching. Against his better judgment, he reached for the door handle and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and biting. Snowflakes swirled around him, each one stinging like a shard of glass. He took a few steps toward the figure, his boots sinking into the unnaturally heavy snow. "Hey!" he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. But their eyes, oh God, their eyes, darted toward him again, their pupils trembling in desperation. Ethan's heart thundered as he approached. The figure's face was pale, almost translucent beneath the frost, and their mouth was frozen mid-scream. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place. But he forced himself closer, extending a gloved hand toward their shoulder. The second his fingers brushed the ice-coated fabric, the figure's eyes rolled back in their head, and a low, keening sound rose from somewhere deep in the blizzard. Ethan jerked his hand away and stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged clouds. The keening grew louder, surrounding him, resonating in his chest like a warning. The figure remained frozen, but the snow around them began to shift, swirling into shapes, shadowy figures barely visible in the storm. Ethan's pulse spiked as he scrambled back to his truck, his boots slipping on the icy ground. He slammed the door shut, threw the truck into gear, and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun for a moment before catching traction, and the vehicle lurched forward, away from the frozen figure and the impossible shapes in the snow. Ethan didn't stop driving until the diner lights appeared faintly through the storm. The bell over the door jingled faintly as Ethan pushed into the diner, its warmth washing over him like a lifeline. The windows were fogged with condensation, but the storm outside was still visible, a relentless cascade of white. Ethan glanced around, expecting to see the usual late-night crowd, a couple of truckers, maybe some teens nursing milkshakes after a movie. The place was empty. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on tables, and coffee cups steamed faintly in the still air. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the scene, but there was no movement, no sound. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. He stepped farther inside, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. A faint draft whispered through the room, making the air feel colder than it should have been. The counter was lined with stools, all unoccupied. One of them was turned slightly, as though someone had just stood up. Ethan moved closer, scanning the room for any sign of life. His unease deepened when he noticed the food on the plates: eggs and bacon, pancakes, toast. All fresh. The coffee was still hot. Something's not right. Ethan reached the counter and hesitated. A radio sat on the far end, its small speaker crackling with static. He leaned over and twisted the dial, trying to find a signal. For a moment, there was nothing but white noise. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. "Repeat. Storm. Stay indoors. Do not." The transmission fizzled, the words lost to the static. Ethan adjusted the dial again, his hands shaking. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The radio sputtered back to life, the voice clearer this time but tinged with panic. "If you're hearing this, the storm is not natural. Do not go outside. They're in the snow. Stay away from the..." The signal cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made Ethan wince. He stepped back, the silence of the diner suddenly oppressive. Outside, the snow was piling higher, burying the parking lot in an ocean of white. Ethan turned toward the window and froze. The figure from the road was there, standing in the middle of the storm, staring at him with those same pleading eyes. Only now, it wasn't alone. The frozen figure stood motionless outside the diner, framed by the swirling blizzard. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, others emerged from the storm, men, women, even children, all encased in ice. Their eyes moved, darting left and right, filled with a terrible, silent desperation. It was as if they were trying to scream, but the frost that bound their bodies stole their voices. Ethan's breath fogged the diner's glass as he stared, frozen in place. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. The silence grew thicker, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind beyond the door. Then, just as he began to back away, he saw it, a flicker of motion deeper in the storm. The first thing he noticed was its size. The shadow in the snow towered above the frozen figures, easily twice the height of a man. Its shape was indistinct, cloaked by the whirling flakes, but its movement was deliberate and slow, like a predator sizing up its prey. With every step, the storm seemed to intensify, the snow falling harder, the wind screaming louder. Ethan stumbled back, his boots catching on the edge of the counter. He gripped the stainless steel surface to steady himself, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind raced. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. The door rattled suddenly, the wind pressing against it like a living force. For a moment, Ethan feared the glass would shatter, letting in the storm and the figures waiting outside. He backed farther into the diner, fumbling for something, anything, to defend himself. His fingers brushed against a metal coffee pot, and he grabbed it instinctively. The radio crackled again, breaking the spell of silence. A voice, distant, faint, and frantic, pushed through the static. "They're watching. Don't let them in. The snow. It's not just..." The transmission cut off with a sharp burst of static, and then the diner went completely silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing. He turned back to the window. The figures were closer now, their frosted forms pressing against the glass, their eyes bored into him, unblinking, pleading. His chest tightened as he realized the frost on the window was spreading. Thin, spidery cracks of ice crept inward, reaching like fingers across the glass. "Get away!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. He swung the coffee pot at the glass, hoping to scare them off, but it had no effect. The figures didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, their eyes begging for release from their frozen prisons. Then he saw it again, the shadow in the storm. It loomed closer, and for the first time, Ethan could make out details. Its form was jagged, its edges sharp and uneven, as if it were made of ice itself. The vague suggestion of limbs and a head emerged from the swirling snow, but its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, a hollow darkness that seemed to drink in the light. As the creature approached, the frost on the windows thickened. The glass groaned under the weight of the ice, and Ethan felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, like the storm itself was alive and pressing against him. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out. With one last look at the frozen figures, Ethan bolted toward the back of the diner. The kitchen was a maze of stainless steel counters and appliances, but he moved with purpose, searching for the rear exit. The door was heavy, reinforced with a deadbolt, and it opened into an alley barely visible through the snow. He hesitated, his hand on the handle. Outside was the storm, the figures, and that thing. But staying here felt worse, like he was waiting for the inevitable. Taking a deep breath, Ethan yanked the door open and stepped into the whiteout. The storm swallowed Ethan instantly. The snow whipped against his face, cutting into his skin like shards of glass. He pulled his jacket tighter and pressed forward, the alley walls offering little shelter. Behind him, the diner loomed like a ghostly shadow, its fogged windows obscured by the swirling white. The snow muffled all sound, creating an oppressive silence that made Ethan's own breathing seem deafening. He stumbled forward, clutching the coffee pot like a lifeline. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The frozen figures were everywhere. They stood in clusters along the streets, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses. Some leaned against lampposts, their faces locked in expressions of terror. Others knelt in the snow, their hands outstretched as if reaching for help. But all of them had the same terrible, pleading eyes. Ethan avoided looking at them directly, but he couldn't help glancing as he passed. One figure, a young woman in a tattered coat, was frozen mid-step, her arms cradling an invisible child. Her eyes followed him as he moved, their silent desperation clawing at his sanity. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the heavy snow. His thoughts raced. The radio's warnings echoed in his mind, fragmented but clear enough to paint a picture. The storm wasn't natural. The figures weren't victims of the cold, but prisoners, trapped by something older, darker. And it was coming for him. Ethan turned a corner and found himself in the town square. The fountain at the center was encased in ice, its surface glistening under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. The storm seemed quieter here, the snow falling in a lazy spiral around the square. But the stillness felt wrong, like the eye of a hurricane. At the edge of the square, he saw it. A massive figure stood among the frozen statues, its hollow face turned toward him. Its jagged limbs shimmered with frost, and its movements were slow, deliberate. It was inspecting the statues, tilting its featureless head as if studying its work. Ethan ducked behind a mailbox, his heart pounding. The creature's presence was suffocating, its weight pressing against him even from a distance. He could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes, an invisible pressure that seemed to pierce through him. Then, it turned. Ethan's blood ran cold as the creature began to move toward him, its limbs scraping against the frozen ground. He gripped the coffee pot tighter, his knuckles white, knowing it was useless, but clinging to it anyway. He had to find the shard. Ethan's breath burned in his chest as he ran, his boots slipping on the uneven ground. The storm swirled around him, alive and pulsing with malevolence. Behind him, the creature moved with a terrifying, deliberate pace. Its jagged limbs scraped against the frozen earth, the sound sending shivers through Ethan's body. The town square disappeared behind a wall of snow, but the icy presence of the creature lingered, pressing against his mind like a vice. Each step felt heavier, as though the storm itself was trying to drag him down. He knew he couldn't run forever. He had to end this. The clues had led him here, to the center of Frostvale, where the storm raged fiercest. And at the heart of it was the shard, the stolen piece of the glacier that had awakened the Frost Warden. If he could return it, maybe he could stop this nightmare. Through the blizzard, Ethan spotted the church at the edge of the square, its steeple barely visible against the white void. The shard had to be there. It was the only place left, the last sanctuary in this frozen hell. He pushed forward, the wind howling in his ears. The doors of the church loomed ahead, heavy and frost-bitten. He threw his shoulder against them, the wood groaning as they creaked open. Inside, the cold followed him like a living thing, curling around the pews and extinguishing the flickering candles that had somehow survived the storm. The shard was there, resting on the altar. It was smaller than he'd imagined, no bigger than a dagger, but it glowed faintly, casting eerie reflections onto the frozen walls. The air around it shimmered, and the oppressive silence deepened as Ethan approached. He could feel the shard's weight, not physical, but spiritual, as if the entire storm was tethered to this single, cursed object. A sound from behind froze him in place, the scraping of ice against stone. Ethan turned, his heart hammering. The creature was inside the church. Its hollow face loomed in the doorway, framed by the swirling snow. It didn't move quickly. It didn't need to. It knew he had nowhere to go. The shard's glow pulsed, brighter and faster, as if reacting to the warden's presence. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for it. The air grew colder with every inch, his fingers burning as frost spread up his arm the moment he touched the shard's surface. It was alive, vibrating with power and rage. The creature took another step forward, its jagged limbs cracking against the stone floor. Ethan gritted his teeth, ignoring the searing cold that bit into his skin. He lifted the shard, its faint light illuminating the warden's terrible form. "I'm giving it back," he shouted, his voice cracking in the frigid air. The warden paused. For the first time, Ethan thought he saw hesitation, an almost imperceptible shift in the creature's stance. The storm outside screamed louder, the wind battering against the church walls as if to keep him from completing his task. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ethan raised the shard above his head and hurled it at the creature. The moment the shard left his hand, the world seemed to shatter. The shard struck the warden's chest, piercing the dark void where its heart should have been. The creature let out a sound that wasn't a roar, but a mournful, bone-chilling wail. The storm outside exploded into chaos, snow and ice swirling in a vortex that tore at the walls of the church. Ethan fell to his knees as the shard's light consumed the warden. Its jagged limbs began to disintegrate, breaking apart into shards of ice that dissolved into the air. The storm contracted, folding in on itself, pulling the blizzard's wrath into the shard. For a moment, the creature's hollow face seemed to turn toward Ethan, almost relieved. Then it was gone. The silence was deafening. The storm had vanished, leaving the church bathed in a pale, eerie light. Ethan sat motionless, his breath clouding the air as the cold seeped from the room. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. Outside, Frostvale lay in ruins. The streets were buried in snow, and the frozen figures remained, their bodies still locked in ice. But their eyes were closed now, their desperate gazes finally at peace. Ethan staggered through the square, the weight of the night crushing him. He had survived, but the town was a graveyard, the scars of the storm etched into every corner. As he reached his truck, buried in the drifts, he paused and looked back toward the church. The shard's glow was gone, its light extinguished. But deep in the shadows of the doorway, Ethan thought he saw movement. A flicker of frost, a faint, hollow gaze. The storm was gone, but the warden's presence lingered, and it was waiting.